Thank you. Before anything, thanks, Vitaly, for inviting me in the first place and for having me here speaking. It's truly an honor. And also thanks for the very short notice invite, because I was preparing this talk last week. So give me a break. Look at my slides. There's a lot of drawings. Don't look at me. So you make me a little less nervous. So I'm a designer leading the Polaris team at Shopify, as I already said. And today I want to give you a glimpse of how my team made a design language update, but also sharing some thoughts on the process. So starting with a bit of context. So for years, the Polaris design language has been relatively unchanged. It was heavily influenced by flat design, as much of the web we know today. And despite a minor update back in 2020, that was basically colors and illustration changes, the core design philosophy barely changed. So if we look in the past, UI had a little more dimensionality. It tried to mimic the real world. But minimalism started to spread because it made for cleaner interfaces, it made things easier to understand, and made the experiences feel a little more approachable. And this was fantastic, especially for Shopify. Whenever Shopify removes complexity from its product, we see that merchant success goes up. So flat design definitely played a role in that. With that said, this minimalism had run its course, or we realized that it had run its course when we saw merchants' feedback on the latest update in classifying the design language as dull, depressing, and bland. And people thought that was that bad. People thought we had too much white space, which didn't really help them get work done. And as a design system, Polaris just helped standardizing these feelings. But the good news is that a design system is there for better and for worse. So we could also leverage the design system to change things for the better. So at the end of last year, I teamed up with another designer with the mission of making an uplift on our design language. So after going through a ton of merchant feedback, we realized that we needed to make the experience feel a little more like a power tool. We learned that the experience, this kind of approachable experience, was great for merchants when they were getting started, but as they started to get any kind of success, then the airiness of the UI just started to get in the way. So they needed something that felt and looked more powerful. But what does that actually mean? So in the start of this exercise, we kind of try to define a couple checkboxes that would allow us to understand whether or not we're hitting the right marks. So the first one is that it's effective. So a Pro Tool is effective in the way that it organizes information and displays it. Then a Pro Tool is also highly functional, in this case with straightforward visuals and in a way that it's not intrusive or decorative. And the Pro Tool is also highly responsive and provides instant feedback. So ultimately, our design language had to make the product feel more effective in the context of commerce, instead of just trying to design our design system as if we were designing a website for a general purpose. But not forget that it should still be aesthetically pleasing and able to create moments of joy, because they were kind of classifying it as depressing, so we wanted to also address that. With that said, these are just words. Design needs visuals. So we started collecting inspiration from products we thought spoke a similar design language to what we were imagining. And most of these were actually physical products, because we didn't want to fall in the trap of following some sort of digital trend. And as we were doing this kind of collection, we started to kind of label or creating two clusters where one was this and another was not this, because it's as important to get your inspiration and classify what you're aiming for, but also the things that you want to avoid. And this helped kind of narrow down the range of our initial exploration. And before we started doing any kind of designing, we also started digging for photos and recordings from previous research studies, just to get an understanding of the environment where merchants do their work. Like what kind of things are surrounding them when they are using the experience, what's on their desk, what objects do they typically use. And we did this because it helped us understand merchants in a different way and find inspiration in objects that could bring a sense of familiarity. And we did this because great design comes from understanding the way that people work in their space and find ways to make their life a little easier. After this, we had like a concrete understanding how we wanted to get started and what was going to be the range of our exploration. So to broaden and kind of speed up our exploration, I brought 2 more designers, so we went from 2 to 4 and started exploring all together for a few weeks. More people was great because we gain more perspectives. It also maximizes our chances of finding something that is worth pushing forward. Now, I can't just ask people go and explore. Because design needs some constraints. If I were to ask them to just explore with what I told you so far, people would have a tough time getting started because they didn't yet have a clear picture. So constraints are good because they create some initial guidelines that you can stick closer or further away as you explore. So the ones that I defined for this initial project, besides this initial idea of making it feel pro, was to make sure that we're keeping existing behavior and patterns, because our focus was to evolve just the design language, not the entire merchant experience. Design extremes. So as you're getting started in exploring, we're not really looking for subtlety. That can come later, and we can pull back and calibrate. So it's really to make things that you would think would never get approved. Then the third was to keep it high fidelity, but also high level. So not care that much about the details. It's more about giving the impression of something that looks final and kind of captures the feeling. The fourth was to mimic real data. So it's really easy to just kind of create a beautiful picture with fake data. So we were trying to look at merchant stores and mimic the ones that look the worst, with like when people don't label products in a small manner, so we can have a better understanding how things would actually look in reality. And the last was just to diversify. So we wanted to have more visual diversity, more options, and we wanted to prevent people at this stage from falling in love with one idea. So one ask of mine was for everyone to like create multiple options, because that way you spend a little time in each one, and you don't kind of start falling in love into one particular one. And this divergent exploration of like 3 to 4 weeks, I think that it wasn't more than that, brought up a ton of cool ideas. So more color, more vibrancy, more meaningful visuals, and more dimensions. We covered a lot of ground in very little time, and we reviewed work on weekly, so we could get inspired by each other's work, share feedback, and go back to some more exploring during that initial phase. And after a few weeks, our focus started to shift from kind of creating new things to refining the things that we had created up to that point. So at that point, it felt like it was the right time to reduce the team back to 2 because we were starting to converge or trying to find points of convergence. The reason for reducing the team at that point is because less is more at that stage, because we wanted to make sure that we had one direction that we could pitch, and that felt strong, and it felt like there was one hand kind of holding the pencil as a metaphor. But there were still 2 designers, so me and another designer in this project, Thomas. We are both very opinionated, and trying to execute on one vision is challenging. We have somewhat different styles, so it was a bit of a process, especially because we never worked together before, up to that point. So we had to build a lot of trust throughout the entire process. And the initial divergent exploration gave us a really good outlet in the beginning to experiment, gave us exposure to other designers' perspective, but also allowed us to learn about what are the things that I can lean on this other person, what are their strengths. But the best thing is that it just gave us time together, since we had never worked together. Because teams need time to learn how to play together. It's important to give them that. Because you can't expect to just put a group of people, no matter how talented they are, and expect great results right away. There's a lot of clashes that happen in the beginning, and you're still learning to work. And there's not a lot of trust, so it's important to think about how much time you're giving people in the beginning. And we definitely needed it, because we had a lot of little small details that we weren't aligned on, and a lot of small details that are still important decisions to make. So let me just cover a few of those, just to give you an idea. So first, the direction, or the general direction. It's really easy to lean too far on one direction. As we were doing these initial explorations, it's really easy to go all in into skeuomorphic, or all in into something that incorporates vibrancy, and then you go overboard. And end up with something that just feels monotone. And as we analyzed our past explorations, we found a lot of valuable elements in the ends of the spectrum, but the real challenge was finding ways to kind of bringing them together and finding the right balance. So that's most of our work was trying to find that. When we leaned too much in the dimensionality and vibrancy, everything became busy and demanded too much attention, and this screen just looks painful, but it was still valuable for the exercise. And then when we tried to lean on the opposite direction, it started to feel very flat. So to narrow down the list of elements that deserved to have a spotlight, and the ones that should play a supporting role, we started from something that was closer to an extreme on something that a little more tactile, since we wanted to kind of move away from the flat and sterile feeling that merchants were reacting to. And then from this point on, we started designing by subtraction. So removing things that we thought were necessary, and up to the point where if we were removing a detail and we felt like the design was losing its soul, then we knew that we would kind of reach a limit of how much we can remove. And after a good amount of iterations, we realized that we could introduce this tactile feeling in our interactions, because those are the moments where merchants actually do something. So the default look of the UI would still be somewhat calm, and the interactions would become your main vehicle to create these moments of joy that we're seeking for. because we wanted this joy to come from accomplishing a task and avoid it to be like eye candy and obtrusive and void of meaning. Speaking of interactions, buttons, as you know, buttons, we already looked at buttons today, so let's look at buttons again. As you know, buttons are one of the most important pieces of an interface because they are the main vehicle or the main visual indicator for the actions that a user can take. So knowing this, it didn't come as a surprise how much iterations and how much scrutiny our buttons had to go through. So we wanted to make buttons feel somewhat real. So we started from mimicking objects in the real world and see how that would translate into a digital interface. And from there was basically an iterative process of making sure the buttons were hitting the right notes. So a lot of factors influenced how the buttons were evolving, from the surrounding UI to the color palette to like how the interaction felt and how it rendered in low DPI screens, and a lot more considerations, just you name it. And we had to go through a lot of push and pull to the point where you might not even notice the differences between some of these versions, but believe me, they are there. You just have to have a really sharp eye. But we did this because we wanted to hit the right note and have the right level of juiciness when it comes to the interaction of the button. So they had to feel tactile, but not too imposing. They had to feel like plastic, not glass. And last, but probably most importantly, the interaction had to feel juicy. So we had to gone to the point where we even moved the label on interaction. And a button may seem like a really small detail to focus on, but all these small details stack up, and that's kind of how we look at everything. Another example of small details that stack up are our icons. So icons are instrumental in reducing text overload on an experience, so making it feel a little more efficient. So besides that, we also saw in the iconography an opportunity to inject a little bit of joy into the experience and a little soul. The challenge with icons is finding the right scale and the right weight. So we strived for icons that were in harmony with the typography. We didn't want them to dominate the interface. We wanted them to feel like a complement. And we also wanted them to have a unique personality. So like trying to find the right balance. Now talking is easy. To figure out what's the best route, the best direction, we had to experiment quite a bit. And for each style iteration, we had to make dozens of icons because we had to see them in context and kind of see which ones were performing the best. With design, seeing is believing, so there's no really way around iteration. Once again, that's why you need time. So after all the iterations, we landed on this set. I think it's the latest, with a 1.5 pixel outline. And there's like a field variance for navigation. These icons performed the best, and they felt more in harmony with our typeface. So just drawing the right amount of attention to themselves. The last detail that I'm going to talk about is the primary color, or the accent color, because this was less about the iterations and more about convincing different stakeholders. Initially, we planned to keep the primary color green because that was the brand color for Shopify. However, as our design direction evolved, we found that green didn't really align what we were trying to push for. Because green is often associated with something that is friendly and approachable, and also it has a meaning. It's like usually used for positive outcomes. So it didn't really lend itself well for the neutrality that we wanted to introduce with the new design language. We wanted the interface to be neutral, allowing colors to be used semantically and with purpose. So we turned to black because it's commonly associated with this kind of pro feeling. And black also brings impact and contrast, which is exactly what we needed for our interactive states. While being neutral, using black as a primary color ensured that when we were using colors, they wouldn't be overshadowed by your primary action, but instead carry their actual meanings. Now, changing the color, as I said, it was more like a political campaign. People were nervous to changing the primary color because we had changed it in the last update. So we had to convince stakeholder after stakeholder and trying to leverage the ones that we were getting on board to convince the next ones. So we managed to succeed, but it just took a lot of discussions and really targeted presentations. Now, this is just like a small sample of some of the decisions that we had to make. Unfortunately, there's no magic formula to get an agreement on these things because visual design can be subjective. So tough debates, experimentation, prototyping, more tough debates are unavoidable. But with this kind of endless loops of iterations, how do we know where and how and when to stop? Because we can keep on going. So we had to kind of keep track of what's important to accomplish. And in our case, we had this small checklist before we were confident in pushing this to senior stakeholders. So the first one is that it's something that we felt excited about, and not just me and Thomas, but also the initial stakeholders that we were bringing on board. So everyone had to be fully backing up the design direction so we could kind of push it further. Then it had to align with the initial brief, obviously. And lastly, that it looked like an upgrade over the current or the previous design language as we applied it to more and more surfaces. So once we had all these checked, we felt like we had a strong position, and then we were ready for the next trial, which were design reviews with senior stakeholders. And these can be really hard, but they can be a turning point for your design direction, because if you're turning a stakeholder into an advocate for your work, that can help you rally, well, you're rallying people around you, and they can help you convince people further down the road. And in this case, we really had to do this because of the scale and the impact that this change would have, because it would impact multiple teams and ask people to stop some things that they were doing. And going into this reviews, we knew that it was crucial to listen, as any designer should know, and address the concerns, but not forgetting to be really assertive and showing the value of the direction that we're trying to push for. Coming with a strong point of view and reacting only to relevant feedback allowed us to really learn or earn stakeholder trust and get some credibility. Because if we're coming with something that feels weak, they will easily kind of break it apart. So it's important to kind of stand their ground and show the value of the things that you're pushing for. So for that, we crafted each presentation deck we crafted each presentation deck towards a specific stakeholder, enabling a discussion to happen at the appropriate Zoom level without alienating anyone. So we wanted to really get into the nitty-gritty details with stakeholders that we knew would care about those little details, And we wanted to keep the conversation at a higher level for stakeholders that were more concerned about strategy or execution. So we made sure that as we were presenting, that we were doing it in a way that was appropriate. And we gave each piece of feedback a fair shot. So these stakeholders didn't feel like they were just throwing their feedback against the wall. And we were also willing to accept when like a piece of feedback would go against our initial gut feel, that maybe that's like we felt like it didn't work, but after trying it, we saw that there's some value, so we would kind of push ahead with some of those pieces of feedback because they strengthen the design language. And as we went through these reviews, we started to avoid the kind of typical initial discussion around design principles and just discussing words, because we noticed like after 1 or 2 reviews that people would get caught up into the semantics and the meaning of those words, and instead of looking at the actual design. So once we learned that, we moved away from trying to get into design principles. We started leading with the designs, and we found that helped shifting the discussions from theory to practicality. So because then they could see and they could kind of decipher what were the values of this design language on their own. And this helped us move forward. So for that, we used a lot of before and after kind of comparisons to show the value of the change. But this wasn't enough to capture the feeling, because that's a big part of the UI. As I said, some of the joy would come through the interaction. So just looking at static mocks doesn't convey that. So we also partnered with a developer that helped us build a prototype or multiple prototypes, which we used also in these reviews. And these prototypes gave people something a little more tangible than mockups to interact with and react to. And to be honest, it's fair to say at this stage that we were spending probably the same amount of time or even more on the presentations and like these targeted presentations than we were on iterating on the actual design language. Because we thought that was really important, and the design language was at the stage where it felt like it was somewhat stable. Then our last review was with the CEO. It was nerve-wracking, as you can imagine, but honestly, I couldn't have asked for a better outcome, because like we went through several stakeholders, so we were learning along the way. So when we got to the CEO, I think we had like a good sense of how to present to him and like what were the things that he cared about. So he was able to see the value in this direction almost immediately. And so like all the time that we spent kind of crafting these narratives and the story around the design language and how we were presenting it was well worth it in the end. Because after that review, everyone was really excited to ship this to merchants as fast as possible. And the best time for doing that was in the upcoming summer editions, which was in July, which gave us 10 weeks to execute the work. Up to this point, we only had Figma mocks, and then we had 10 weeks to build it or to make it happen. Previously, it would have been impossible to ship like an holistic change like this across a complex application like Shopify's admin in 10 weeks. But luckily, the Polaris team had spent the past year gearing up for something like this, with a mission of getting the admin, Shopify's admin, to be close to 90% of Polaris coverage. So for that, the team overhauled Polaris tokens, simplified the release process from 3 steps to 1, created migrations and linking tools, and also created this coverage dashboard that helped visualize where our coverage is. We also advocated and incentivized and partnered with feature teams to use Polaris components and Polaris tokens, and we updated hundreds of lines of code to make sure that we were leveraging Polaris every time it made sense. And after a year of work, we went from 49% to 86.6% coverage, which is quite a lot. And the remaining is probably not necessary, so we are probably in a good number. Now, it's probably good to mention that this effort required an initial investment with improvements that are happening only below the surface. So they didn't yield a noticeable return for a year. But these small improvements are kind of stacking up and had a compounding effect and enabled us to make this kind of drastic change across the admin in a matter of weeks. It actually only took us 3 weeks to update the styles across the admin, and we could see the new design language in a matter of 3 weeks. But then we had to go and chase all the remaining 14% that didn't look, it just looked like the old design language, and work on updating that. So that's where we spent the remaining 7 weeks. So during those 7 weeks, we had to make sure that the design language was meeting, the implementation was meeting our quality bar. We had to coordinate with dozens of other teams that were not only releasing new functionality for summer editions, but now had to be guided through how they could adapt those features to the new design language. We had to become owners of multiple areas that had no clear ownership. We had to provide support to designers and developers across the organization. And because this work was going to be featured in marketing materials, we also had to work with marketing during that entire time. So there was a lot of work happening, and my team was really stressed out and overworking. But this was all great on-the-ground research to show us how Polaris needs to continue to evolve to be a better system for the consumers of our admin. With that said, you may be wondering what we actually shipped, so I'll just cover that quickly. So the new design language almost literally elevates the admin by incorporating some tactility and some depth, mirroring some of the tools we saw on merchants' desks. We wanted to bring some satisfaction and joy into the merchant journey, so made even the simplest actions, like buttons they interact with every day, feel satisfying and fun. Because this is still a tool of work, we balanced these moments of joy with an increased focus on efficiency. So we reduced space and text sizes across the board to use space more efficiently. And we picked Inter as a typeface because it was specifically crafted for enhancing legibility of small text on computer screens. For common actions, we decided to lean more on actions. We were very verbose before, and using icons as intuitive shortcuts for merchants to be able to navigate swiftly while avoiding an excessive amount of text in the interface. And these icons, we redesigned the whole set to perfectly match our typography. Even though lightweight and efficient, we tried to make sure that they still felt approachable and had a bit of a soul in them. Our color palette is a bit more in your face and vibrant. When we use colors, we want the communication to be strong and clear and meaningful. So green means go, red means danger, there's no half measures and misinterpretations. And we also defined a signature curve for motion that we called snappy, which is really quick, so you barely notice it, but it gives people a cue to where something is coming from. And besides motion, we're also leveraging color and depth to make sure that UI is feeling responsive and feels quick. So merchants don't have to pause to understand if something is interactive or not. With all this said, we're far from being done. We have to keep evolving our design language. To be the most professional tool merchant can rely on. That means always looking to the future and never letting ourselves grow stale, because software is never done. And we have some other things in the works, like the new illustration style and other improvements. But now, just to wrap up, I know I'm over time. I just want to do a quick recap, so we shipped this massive update in 10 weeks. The way I broke it down, it may seem like we followed a pretty linear process, and we really know what we were doing. But the reality was a bit more chaotic and time-consuming. Beyond the infrastructure work that made that happen in 10 weeks possible, it's also important to mention the 8 months that we spent in design explorations, prototyping, testing, and revisions. These 8 months were not planned. That's just the time it took. It could have been more, could have been less if any of the variables in the process had changed. This because exploration takes time and is far from being a linear process. It's like trying to find your way out of a maze in the dark. You take paths that lead nowhere. You have to circle back. There's no shortcuts. And this is especially harder when you have to bring other people on board on that journey. So if there's one thing you remember from this talk, I don't want it to be the juicy buttons. Instead, remember that good design can't be rushed. When we rush, we get tunnel vision. And we find, and we get like a reduced field of view. So you may miss out on the best solution to the problems that you're trying to solve. Because time is precious, it's key we avoid finding ourselves in a scenario like this, where we don't have control over our own time. Designers need time to focus, and probably even more important, designers need time to wonder and to dream, especially when they are expected to innovate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Cool. Wow, I don't know how much time you spent on the illustrations.
A little.
A lot.
But that's fun for me.
Oh, yes, that's wonderful. We have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to bring them up. Amanda will let me know just how much time we have. We have 10 minutes. Excellent. One question that came up was, when exactly were developers involved in the process? At which point?
We had a developer like from the early days that was helping us prototyping, but they were brought along a bit further, like closer to when we were about to release.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Which I would have changed that. It's just like that was the resources that we had to explore.
And basically talking about resources, by the way, so you said it could have been less time, could have been a bit more time if you, and so on. How is it decided? So was it just kind of a tough, strict deadline we have to release by summer?
No.
That's it? And then you kind of roll back and say, okay, so we're here now, so this is how we're going to run this.
No. So we started last year, and there was the intention of evolving the design language, and that's the reason we had limited resources. So it was just me and another designer exploring to make sure that we were keeping it low cost. And we knew we needed time to explore. So the fact that it ended up being released in July was just kind of a coincidence that the time that we reviewed with the CEO happened to be in a position where he could ask for it to be released in the summer editions, and we had 10 weeks, and we accepted that as something that we could accomplish.
I see.
Our intention, as we were presenting to the CEO, was actually we were looking at like a year of implementation with other things that we wanted to build. So we had to like cut down on some of the things like the illustrations and some other things.
But would you say that some parts are still kind of in the old language or being kind of...
Yeah, there are some things that still look like the illustration style is still the old one. And we didn't really change it because we're going to address that still this year. But the general feeling that you get if you use the admin should feel like what I was presenting. So we made sure that we were building the right things that took us to like 90%, and now we have to figure out the rest, the remaining 10%.
Okay. Andy is wondering, how do you measure the actual user impact of the design decisions that have been made? And what role did user validation or testing play during the design uplift?
how do we measure? So we had like some testing sessions with different merchants towards the end of the process. The way that we were thinking about design language was actually less about what's the user what the user wants, but how do we want to be perceived as a brand. And that's kind of what we're trying to build. And the way that we were testing with merchants was just trying to make sure that we are validating that we're not creating disruption to their work, and we're making a change that has the perceived effect. But with this is mostly visual design, so it's hard to have like a tangible number or a measurement. So the way that we measured was mostly like internally through different stakeholders and finding if we were representing Shopify in the way that Shopify wanted to be represented.
And I'm wondering, so in general, would you say, so Polaris has been around for a while, and at some point, 2020, right, was the recent uplift.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, how do you, so do you expect, let's say, these frequent changes to come in relatively often? Like that you're saying that the design system team was actually prepared for this. This is actually quite incredible to
the team was preparing because we knew it's not a matter of if something will change, it's a matter of when. Because design has to adapt and evolve to what users and people want, and that's ever changing.
Right, but then would you say that it depends on, like, basically is it like literally brand perception being a main reason for that, or was it kind of based on user research, users not being able to complete the task successfully? Was it because something that came up was blunt, dull?
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not working.
Yes.
It's just perceived in a dull way. So I'm wondering, was it more of a branding exercise or branding purpose-driven exercise? Or was it user?
It's a bit of a mix. So there's like the way it's the idea of how Shopify wants to be perceived. So that's like the branding side of it. But also some of the decisions that we're making, like making the UI more dense and things smaller, we're trying to address merchant frustrations. We know we have, and we have an internal tool that is called Merchant Frustrations, where we log those. Where when merchants start to be successful, as I was mentioning in the talk, they start complaining about the airiness and like there's too much space. They want to see more things and they can't because the UI is just made for like a website.
Yeah, this is actually quite typical in enterprise applications, right? Where you see that actually white space is overrated. Very often you actually want to see a lot, like very dense information presented because this is important for people to be able to act on quickly, right?
Because people will scan, they will not try to take things piecemeal.
Exactly, right. One question that came from Paul. Paul has opinions.
Okay.
I don't know, Paul, if you're here.
Everyone does.
Paul has opinions. He's saying, has web design drifted too far from the basics? For example, your button example goes to a lot of effort to make a button look tactile and raised. But the default browser button style does that too, unlike most websites now where buttons are flat rectangles. Oof.
I mean, you can take everything that you get by default, but we're trying to hit the right, as I said, we're trying to hit the right notes and find something that has, kind of has the perception that we were looking for. So that's why we went through all those iterations.
Right.
And we're not taking we're trying to have control over what the button looks like. So that's why we're not using a default, and the amount of iterations is just part of the process. Okay. I don't know how to respond.
That's okay. That's fine. Mighty is wondering, has a question about design review and feedback. We just have 3 more minutes, right? Design review and feedback. How do you qualify or describe relevant feedback? And how did you choose to address it?
So that's as a designer, I think you're empowered to take feedback. So first of all, you don't have to respond right away when you're reviewing. So when you're reviewing, I think there's a I like this automatic response of people that sometimes they feel like they need
Defensive,
to address.
right?
Defensive,
Yeah.
The way that I look at it is that when we're presenting, we're trying to first of all ask people to leave their feedback to the end so they can see the whole story rather than jumping in on something that they shouldn't react to. And then it's a matter of collecting all the feedback and kind of finding the things that are really that stick out as something that you should look at, or something that you haven't thought about, or something that you haven't explored. Because oftentimes, a lot of the feedback that is easy to dismiss is things that you've tried in the past and you know don't work. So it's easy to just go back to some of the old explorations and pull that back into the next review and say, this is why this doesn't work. But
Right.
it's important to still come with the proof, otherwise people will think you're just dismissing some of the feedback.
Okay.
But yeah, it's trying to be assertive and kind of showing your homework when you have to show your homework.
One question from Anonymous. Did you spend more time on Shopify buttons or on your awesome drawings?
On the buttons.
Okay.
My drawings don't have any stakeholders to review, so they're
Well,
easy.
you are your stakeholder.
I'm the only
And you
stakeholder.
probably have a lot of opinions on things as well. One question that also came up, well, maybe a minute. Could you give us a bit of a glimpse about how you structure the Figma files in your in Polaris to make sure it caters to the needs of individual product teams?
I mean, our Figma files are available online. You can have a look at them. So that's
Okay.
that's the answer.
Fair enough.
They're open source.
Okay. There is also a note, I would say, not a question. A note saying that has the best shoes ever, and then somebody added, and shorts.
Thanks.
Okay. So
It's hot, so I couldn't wear pants.
designers, right? Designers. Yeah, you can tell. Well, I think this is it for now, actually. Do you have a dream project? So if you had to, let's say, revamp the design system, kind of make some adjustments, and you had, I don't know, 8 more months to work on it, what would be your next big ambition within the design system, within Polaris, or within the Shopify products in general?
Within Shopify, there are still things to do on this, like the illustration style. That's one thing that I'm really looking forward to work on, and I'll be working on once
I
I'm
have no
back.
doubt.
Yeah, so that's the one thing. Right now we're working on documentation because we have third-party developers, and with an update like this, we have to now create documentation so they can also leverage the design system. That's what we're doing right now. But then after that, illustrations, I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, I can't wait. And I can't wait for your illustrations in your wonderful blog posts as well. So I think this is always a joy to read.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for being with us, Jose.
Thank you.